for Odysseus to start telling his adventure story. So I'll get onto that and move on to book 9. So what do we want to say about book 8? What thoughts and observations do we have?
I only had one question, which I'm going to find with that. Too far into the book for that question. At the beginning, it's the question of the bard and the muse. Yeah, what's it called? Muse. Muse is the right word. Because the bard comes there and gets inspired by the muse to sing those songs. But who actually is the muse?
Anyone know more about the muses? I think my recollection is that there are actually, I think, 9 of them, I think, of different.
I read that.
The appropriate muse.
Yeah.
Presumably they're on a kind of 898 number. You just dial up the muse that you require and she delivers. I don't really know what she, Rena, any?
Well, they're inspiration, really.
Yeah.
They stand for poetic or other creative inspiration, and sometimes they bless you and sometimes they don't. So sometimes you can produce something and sometimes you can't. So
I don't know whether this is part of the kind of the theory of psychology. I mean, that's probably even too grand a term to call it. You know, the way that they thought that people were, in the same way that the gods and the goddesses seem to be, they seem to inspire people, or they seem to prevent them. They seem to be kind of part of the almost of the subconscious. Oh, I left this on because I thought it might be someone trying to get to the session. It was actually a trumpet of patriots.
sick of that.
I haven't got it.
Are you feeling left out? Are you?
Someone else gets them, but I don't.
No, it's when you were asleep. It's a matter of about 10 something.
So I have now turned that on to silent.
Yeah.
Yes. As I said, there is this book by some Professor Jane, a philosopher, somebody Jane, called the bicameral something of the brain, and his theory was that it was round about this time that humans discovered an inner voice. That before that they attributed these inner voices to either madness or to the gods or the muse, and that it's round about this time, almost within the Odyssey, I think he posits that. People began to realise that it was themselves and that it was their own inner voice.
Right. So it's his own inner voice which inspired him to sing those songs.
Yeah.
So that would suggest that the muse told them to.
Yeah. And I mean, as with so many things in the Odyssey, it's kind of mysterious. We don't really know whether this was a full, strong belief that there was a god, a goddess who you were channeling.
Yeah.
Although I note that great philosopher Keith Richard of the Rolling Stones said that he often feels that with songs he is channeling. He's not creating something. It's something that comes through him.
Yeah.
And I suppose if you played guitar for 750 years as he has, then you are so attuned to
It happens automatically.
Music.
It almost happens automatically in that case. It's deep in his subconscious, and he thinks. I mean, yes. I mean, the muses is a word that's still used.
Yes.
Yeah.
In everyday speech, or when in literature, you're writing, reading a book of any, that they often will talk about in arts of any sort.
Yeah. Or if Picasso wants to get a girl to take her clothes off, he will make her his muse.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
I've
Yes.
never been bold enough to try that.
He wasn't the only one who did it, was he?
No. It kind of Gatsby talks a fair bit about this sort of stuff.
I suppose their relationship with their religious beliefs would be similar as now. People might believe in a Christian God, but they'll still half be skeptical or joke
Not more
and
about it.
or joke about it, or have little sayings, like touch wood or the devil will hit you and that kind of thing, So I think we're quite capable of having both belief, I don't know if it's belief, both states of mind, I suppose.
Yeah.
Superstitions and beliefs.
Yeah, belief is a much more elastic term than we sometimes think. Isn't it? Do they really believe this? Well, some would have done, I suppose, and some would have believed in it passionately.
Yeah.
And I suppose there is also the sense that by the time the poem was written down, this was about the heroic age a long time ago.
Yeah.
So you can kind of then, I suppose, compartmentalize this belief that this is what things were like back then.
And there's perhaps a certain ironical tone, is there? Do you feel?
Yeah.
A bit of humour in. I mean, the way that Odysseus is described as being larger than life and this incredibly handsome man with this big body and how Athena has blessed him. It's all quite exaggerated, I thought. I love this, I could really see the man and think, oh, I'd like to see him. I would have followed into the court.
But he does
had a look,
He does get charged up from time to time by the gods.
Yeah.
They make him look even grander.
Even grander.
Yeah.
I guess you would look grander if you think there's a god looking out for you.
Yeah.
Right, a personal one,
Yeah.
Not quite sure where this is, if it's in the Iliad or in the Odyssey, but somewhere Odysseus' shape is described, and he has a noticeably long torso and short legs, which is perhaps not quite the heroic.
No.
image that,
He needs a bit of Athena's help.
He's got he's got a low centre of gravity, so he makes a really good footballer.
Yeah.
Yes.
And can throw the discus really well.
I thought you need longer legs to throw the discus because you keep your balance as you swing it around.
One thing that gets me is their food and drink.
Oh.
The wine is watered down all the time. I can't really see how if you water wine down like they say, they watered it down a hell of a lot. It'd be much good.
I don't know much about the making of wine, but it does almost seem to be stored in a kind of concentrated form.
Yes. But the other thing is, when they slaughter the animals, I know they haven't got refrigeration, but they eat them straight away. There's no talk about butchery or anything like that. Money come in later, they seem to tear them all to bits and just eat them,
Take the skin off, chuck it on the fire.
And there's no talk about anything else. It's just you go and grab sheep or goats or whatever, and
no vegetable.
There's no Mediterranean diet here.
No, yes.
No Mediterranean.
Yeah, I mean, it's very unlike what the real Greek diet would have been.
Yes,
This would have been a very rare luxury if you got them at all.
And maybe that's what the whole point of focusing on. It's to show you that this is an elite almost, that banqueting was something that was in that sort of eras was not something that the poor people did. It was only the elite, the rich, and that meat would be. So again, it's sort of separating that level of society is from probably the people who are listening, who would be just the ordinary everyday man. I mean, it's very much an elitist society.
I got one word that said bread in there.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it before, but I picked it up. And I hadn't seen it since, it just mentioned it once.
But that was the poor bard that got the bread. He didn't get meat, I noticed. He got a bowl of bread and some wine.
Starving artist.
So, they must have made bread, but they don't mention it much.
Yes, there it is. It's on the same page on 80 something with the basket full of bread and a cup of wine.
Yeah.
The herald gets that for the blind bard. Yeah.
And I quite sorry.
Oh, you go, Rena.
I don't know if it's finished.
Yeah.
I just on the bard and the bread and the wine, why I think there's this vein of irony that's very amusing is the bard, I think, often says things that are self-reflecting. Like when he's describing Odysseus's reply on page 190, the top of page 197, he says,
I think it's sorry, what a line.
a line just above 200, so it'd be line on this page, I can see line 2, so just above the line 200.
Yeah.
You're a reckless fool, I see that. So he's picked up the gauntlet from Leo, what's his name, the Laodamas. And then he says the gods don't hand out all their gifts at once, and I think you mentioned that, Steve. And then he says, one man may fail to impress us with his looks, and I can't help thinking that's the bard. But a god can crown his words and with beauty, charm, and men look on with delight when he speaks out. So I think the bard is sort of praising himself. I might not be as good looking as Odysseus, but I can sing.
I'm not too bad.
I can sing.
I suppose I've been, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but at the sophistication of thought and how contemporary it is, really, with the same sorts of issues, so it search for meaning and trying to find belief in something. It's especially in chapter 9 and 10, I think more so than perhaps chapter 8, but I would.
Say more about that. When you say the sophistication, what do you have in mind?
Well, a lot of the issues that come up are things that would be things we're encountering in our lives now. So that's what I mean by being contemporary, even though it was written so long ago. Because you might think that perhaps the thought at that time would be more primitive, and certainly the sophistication of thought would be more primitive, but it's quite sophisticated and complex, I suppose. For us to unravel now, maybe it wasn't complex for people at the time because they were familiar with the story.
I suppose it depends. I mean, you were looking at a particular translation, and each translation will be slightly different. And this one really is, as you say, quite 20th century or 21st century sort of words.
Yeah.
And like, for instance, when the men are sort of saying, "Oh, we didn't get our share," that's that fear of missing out, which is, and the little things like the boasting, and then they losing his temper and showing off. He was throwing the discus sort of thing. You can see that happening in a situation today with blokes, one bloke cheeses another one, and so those sorts of things. You're right.
They're human.
They're very much. You can very much identify with it, even though some of the things like the referral to the gods or the bard singing, and there's lots of words, it still is not. It's not feel like you're reading a Victorian novel or something like that. It's really
Where the manners are very different.
It's really quite identifiable. As a human being.
Yes, that's what I'm really getting at, I suppose.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? I pointed this out before, that this is the first writing that we have in Western civilization.
Yeah.
That they in the pre-Mycenaean era, there had been writing, and the Phoenicians had a form of writing, but by this time, from the 12th century down to about the 8th century, it had died out. And we don't have any writing at all that is older than this. And it's quite extraordinary that it should be so developed and sophisticated and indeed complete.
What is sophisticated for me is that when he meets the one-eyed monster and he gives him wine, the wine is so strong. He has 2 cups and that's it. He falls over. I mean, Ordinary wine would do that to you. It must be brandy or something like that.
Well, I mean, this is in the undiluted, I mean, you mentioned before that it was typically
Yeah.
diluted 20 times
Yeah.
in water, and this is obviously undiluted, so.
It's probably, it's, when they say wine, they don't go into any detail about the difference. They just talk about wine and diluting it. They don't even say what colour it is. Oh, except that they do call it the red wine sea. And they talk about things like that.
They don't give you a percentage, 12% alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't.
But that's historically correct, that the wine was diluted. It was never drunk. I mean, that's not just here. I mean, it's in from many other sources that, from archaeology and bits and pieces, that yes, wine was never drunk.
No, the Greeks always.
Yeah, it was always diluted.
Yeah,
Not just the Greeks, the Romans, the
yeah.
Etruscans, right across the Mediterranean.
Yes.
Because obviously it probably was somehow or other almost brandy or
It
double
had to
distilled.
be to knock him out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it obviously must have had a huge amount of alcohol.
It was
very
very,
big cup.
even when it's not diluted, noticed, I think I was in Portugal, people always had the wine glass and the water glass. Yeah,
And alternated.
yeah, alternating, yeah.
I've been thinking about food generally in sort of modern, well, all the literature I've read, I think, and TV programs. Food is very evocative, and I think authors use it, and in TV programs, which we watch a lot of, there's always, like if it's a cop show, there'll always be a steaming cup of coffee, or if it's something else, there'll be like a party where someone goes and fetches drinks for someone else or something.
Yeah.
And it's so, I'm not saying it carries on from that tradition, but it starts there. It starts in the Odyssey, this use of food to because I guess we can all relate to food and wine, modern day coffee and that.
Yeah, it kind of symbolizes things.
The coming together of people.
There's a saying when you're coming together with someone, break the bread, yeah.
But with things like coffee and alcohol, like in the 30s, if you watch old films, they're forever slashing back whiskey and brandy, like 10 o'clock in the morning. and it was I'm sure it was like a symbol of wealth, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, like for instance, in Indian society, probably not just today, but so 20, 30 years ago, drinking whiskey was a sign of status. So you didn't drink, you drank whiskey. And if you were particularly between men, if you were, at the men over, you'd drink the whiskey. And I think it was very similar in the Chinese society too, when they first started, versus drinking whiskey.
Because it was expensive.
Well, it was expensive, yes.
And you could put it in a decanter with nice glass.
And you didn't have to worry about the taste of wine, whether it had honey flavours or blackberries or greenberries or whatever.
Well, I think whiskey drinkers do.
They're also in the Mediterranean,
There's
there's a
whiskey.
shortage of water. Because I remember being stuck on an island one night with no water, and all we had was either an ouzo.
Oh,
And I
God.
tell you, I'll never drink the stuff again. I got so thirsty, that's all we had. No water.
I got drunk on Messina once, never again.
Even in contemporary films, if you get a group of men who are trying to outdo one another with their importance and wealth, they use whiskey. They have a collection of whiskey, they have opinions about which must be better.
Yes.
And you.
Whether it's 10 years old or 20 years
Yes.
old.
Whether it's single malt or whether it's
Yes.
I just feel like yawning,
Well, it's one of
But
the
it's
one of the characteristics of James Bond, isn't it, that he's very particular about his martini.
Martini.
Shaken
Yeah.
yeah.
Chateau Lafite 61
Yeah.
or whatever that.
Yeah.
It's definitely not 62. But I guess this is one of the reasons why we travel, isn't it? It's because when you see the different a different cultural set of associations around food or drink or hospitality, you begin to realise that things that we take as being absolutely sort of natural, you know, the order in which we eat food is not, there's nothing, it's not a natural law that you go from soup to nuts, you know.
Louis the 16th brought that in, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Lotus eaters was quite interesting because they didn't stay long there, I'll tell you, he got out of that place really quickly.
Sorry,
The Lotus eaters.
yeah.
Because that's the quickest place he got out of in all his travels. He went in and he just saw what happened to the couple of men who lost their memory or whatever it was. So I think it must have been some sort of drug in the Lotus or the, you know.
Opium.
Could have been fermented.
Well,
I assume that was
whatever.
opium.
Yeah, which they,
It's interesting about the Lotus eaters. It's one of those sayings, you know how lots of sayings from Shakespeare have come down into the vernacular, and that's one, we call someone a lotus eater. I mean, I've heard that sort of said over the years, you know, referred to someone who's, you know, not quite with it or living or just doing nothing much. They're a lotus eater.
sorry.
So it's interesting, and that's where it must, the fact that it's in this book, again, like Shakespeare's come into the Western.
Charmian Clift uses the title for one of the novels, which was set on Hydra, about their experiences, and that's how that community extracts from
Yes,
environments, having a life in Hydra in the late 50s, early 60s, something.
And about when I think Leonard Cohen.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
And all of those people. But before we leave the shores of the Phaeacians in Book 8, I think I would like us just to talk about the way that Odysseus responds to the challenge. You know, they go down to the contest, the field where all the contests are taking place, and he's feeling old, and every day of his long exhausted life and the battering that he's taken. But all it takes is one young bloke to start kind of poking him in the chest, and he fires up. As how you read that, is it, as you said, it sounds like, you know, the sort of the response of any old bloke to being challenged by a, you know, it feels very human in that way. Is it a mistake on his part? Is he allowing himself to get carried away, or what?
Well, it's his pride, yeah. It's his sense of self being challenged, you know, and that's his response. In other words, he's a red-blooded male. He's not he's a warrior. I mean, if you challenge his abilities, he's not going to just sit there and go do.
Initially, though, he doesn't accept the challenge. It's only when he's really goaded that
he sort of
he
says,
does.
oh really?
Yeah.
You know, I'm so tired. I'm so grief-stricken. I really have to do this.
But for a man who goes into battle, slashing left, right, and centre, killing all and sundry, and then a young bloke comes up and says, "Oh, you're no good." What's he going to do? I mean, he's an alpha male, isn't he? He's going to sit back and say, "Oh, no, he's not," because it'd be quite out of character, really.
But it's quite dangerous for him to have done that, because it was the king's son.
Yeah.
Yes, normally you wouldn't.
But also, doesn't their acceptance of him as a hero is partly what's going to allow the ship to go and take him home. I mean, he's got to attract a following in a way, doesn't he? In that society.
But he'd already, the ship that was going to take them was already ready.
They always change their minds.
Yes, they could.
Yeah.
And he wasn't completely overtaken by risk, because he did admit that he couldn't outrun them. Because he was
Yeah,
lame.
because of his short legs.
Yes.
Whereas a completely alpha male never admit any weakness, would they? Maybe.
Well, see, one of the things that strikes me is now having become very familiar with the Odyssey all of the way through, is that and we must remember that these stories, the story was told repeatedly over many generations, over centuries. So there's a lot of foreshadowing that goes on, because that situation actually rather resembles the kind of circumstance that Odysseus is going to find when he gets back to Ithaca, which is because at this point in Book 8, he still hasn't said who he is. It's still an unknown quantity until he feels comfortable enough. And you could argue that partly what he's doing is being provocative and sort of seeing what the consequences are, which might make him feel safer to declare who he is. But I guess what I'm thinking is that when it comes to it, he's allowing the circumstance to provoke him. You can almost hear the sort of the blood pounding in his head. And he kind of jumps up and says, "I'll show you little whippersnappers." Whereas that's not what's going to be good enough when he's back at Ithaca. His timing has to be impeccable, and he can't allow his anger to drive his behaviour.
Or his reputation, because before this, they sang that whole song that before this, the bard sings tells the story of Odysseus's hero's journey through the Trojan War, and he covers his face with his cloak and cries. So it's like he's got his reputation there as well.
Yeah, he didn't want to pick a fight with the other son. There are two sons there, and he actually obviously decided which one would be the king's. He wouldn't accept the challenge from probably the eldest son, the future monarch.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
When he finishes, and he throws the discus, and he sort of finished the silence. And then the old king has to come in and say, and he gives a nice little speech and calms things down. But they're all obviously amazed. They can't think of anything to say.
Yeah, he said he finished, all stood quiet, hushed, only else, whatever his name is, found a way to answer. Stranger friend, nothing you say amongst us seems ungracious. You simply wanted to display the gifts you're born with, stung that a youngster marched up to you in the games, mocking, ridiculing your prowess as no one would, but who had some sense of fit and proper speech. So more or less what he's saying was that his son
Was out of place.
without a place, and you, he is obviously the king's a wise man. He refused the whole situation.
He was just taking a bit of a risk picking on the son of the king. The king might have just said, "Away with you."
I think you had to be a pretty good person to be a king those days, because otherwise you'd get overthrown, or they didn't last long if they weren't any good. I tell you, I mean, you go right back.
Yeah.
I mean, so this king seemed to be, everyone seemed to like him, and in his speeches gathered all the people around him and said, "Look, we're going to do this, follow me," and all this. So I think he seemed to be a very good king.
He'd been a bit blessed by the gods too, hadn't he, Alcinous? And Alcinous also had a bit of a blessing from the gods, and they'd given them this new island to live on to get away from the Cyclops or something. I can't remember all the details. So he
always helpful to have the gods helping.
Yes.
But it was that unusual. I mean, when they they never know what they're going to find when they go to an island. They go to this place and he's given everything, paid, fed, water, everything. But it's not so in all the other places.
No.
Well, the interesting thing is we're going to merge into the next chapter soon, but one of the things which upset me was when they got to this other island, the first thing they did was they attacked the city and killed all the men.
Hmm.
So, that was a really different sort of behavior on their part, put it mildly.
See, Alexander the Great used to do exactly the same thing. He'd go up to a city and say, "You're going to give up and let me come in." And if they didn't, he'd sack the city.
Yeah, yeah, but that was,
Or lay siege to it, as you know. So, I mean, it's exactly the same sort of thing, and that's much, much later. So, you know,
It seemed to have been the thing he did, didn't it? I mean, that's how you do it.
that's what you
Wasn't no question of it.
There seems also to be something about the generations going on, that the young chap is both kind of callow youth, but also because they live isolated on this island, he hasn't had to learn manners. Now, if you remember in the first books when Telemachus was going to meet King Nestor and King Menelaus, and he's kind of seen the degree of sophistication of very sort of worldly peoples who do have a lot of connections with other societies. These people here seem to be isolated. And Alcinous, you're right. He survives as king because he's smarter than the rest. He's not, he knows how to say the right thing and how to defuse a potentially dangerous situation. And Odysseus sounds like this old war-weary traveller who's just desperate for home and doesn't need this shit.
Yeah.
I mean,
Just go home now, please. I'm tired.
I mean,
when they
just think about it, that some of the next bits actually occurred before he wrote. So when he when he attacked that island and basically got when they brought some reinforcements in 9, that was before he may have understood the world and how to handle it, driving a new.
Yes, because you mentioned before about the sophistication of the if you like, of
The ideas.
scenes and the ideas and the psychology of the people. But what really struck me the very first time that I opened the Odyssey and first started reading it is the sophistication of the way in which the story is told.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to remind yourself that all of the adventures are told first person by Odysseus to the Phaeacians.
Yes.
And it's the bard who is telling us in the voice of Odysseus, telling us almost as if we are the Phaeacians. And that also then filters the way that we have to understand the adventures. Now, I'm not quite sure quite what that means as to whether, because one of the things Odysseus is famous for is telling a tale, but also being a good liar. So, do we have to read these adventures skeptically? Because he always comes out well. He always comes out as being the guy who sorted the problems out. So actually that leads us on. What I thought might be worth looking at, if I can get there we go, is just to kind of set out where we're going. So as we know at the beginning of book 9, if you have been reading ahead, Odysseus he gets to sing for his supper. He gets to repay the hospitality that he's already been given and the promise of this extraordinary Uber home to Ithaca. But how he's gonna pay for his supper is by telling all of these adventures and finally revealing who he is. So what are the adventures? And what's interesting is that this is the Odyssey that most people know of. If you ask someone what happens in the Odyssey, they will talk about the Cyclops or those kinds of.
I was quite surprised how little of the book is actually about his trip.
So and in fact that's what I've done, because I've actually just briefly. So this isn't original, this list, because I'll show you in a moment where I got it from. But what I've done is to just allocate the number of lines that are given to each of the adventures. So the Siconians, which is the one that you mentioned, Elliot, which is straight from Troy, he goes and they go on a rampage and they find another city, kill all the men, take the women and the goods of booty and divide them up between themselves. I don't know quite what happens to them, because we never hear of these women or of the booty again.
And they couldn't fit that whole town a woman into a little boat like that, isn't it? Yeah.
So that's the first one, and then there is a storm followed by adverse winds, and then we get the Lotus Eaters, and again, that is quite a brief adventure for something that, you know, we've all heard of the Lotus Eaters, and there's only 25 lines of it, and this is where it comes from. There's no prior source for the Lotus Eaters story or the concept of, you know, being the sort of idlers in paradise kind of thing. The Cyclops, which is a big chunky detailed adventure, which rounds out book 9. And then into book 10 we have this Aeolus, which is the bag of winds story, and Odysseus and his men get within sight of Ithaca. They're so close, they can see the smoke from the villages, from the town on Ithaca, and then they get blown back again through, well, we will see why, how. Lestrygonians, which is another place I think where the word bread comes up, Keith, because I think Odysseus says we want to find out if these are bread eaters or not, and they turn out not to be bread eaters, not even to be pig eaters, but to be man eaters. And then we have Circe, the goddess who turns men into pigs, and that's a big juicy story. And then in book 11 we get the underworld, which is one of the most, it is quite uncanny. Like when we get to book 11, it's an extraordinary chapter, an extraordinary episode. It kind of makes your skin crawl, really. And then we circle back to the remainder of the Circe story, and then we get the Sirens, and again that's a relatively brief adventure, but and it's an absolute, you know, everyone knows what Sirens are, or we think we do. And then Scylla, the first part of the Scylla and Charybdis story, we get the Scylla part, and then Thrinacia, which is the cattle of the sun god story, where the men commit this terrible sacrilege, which we will get to. And then we circle back to the other half of the Scylla and Charybdis story with Charybdis. And then we've already had the Calypso story, so he just kind of finishes that off. The source for this is a terrific book that talks about the way the story is told, a narratological commentary on the Odyssey, which I'm very much enjoying, but it's kind of quite thick and dense. Then I went through the adventures again with a different perspective, which is to say, Odysseus makes it back to Ithaca. He's the only one who survived, which is an extraordinary fact. I mean, from a narrative point of view, it's important because if you still had 600 men, well, there'd be no peril. You just march in, kill all of the suitors, and just reassume his kingdom. That isn't what happens, and it's hard to kind of understand what a terrible leader Odysseus really is. Yeah. Because when you think about the ways in which he loses his men. So leaving Troy, they have 12 ships, and this is kind of back calculated. We know that there's a reference to one of the ships, and they lose 6 men from each of the ships. Yes. In a moment we will see that, and then we're told how many were left. So it's assumed that these ships are what they call penticonters, which is about 57 people per ship, 50 on the oars and 7 in the kind of support crew, the gubernator and captain and all the rest of it. And with a few extras, so it comes to about, he's got about 700 men leaving Troy. So the first one is the Ciconians, where as you said, Elliot, they successfully conquer the Ciconians, but make the terrible blunder of sticking around. I mean, it's just like, yeah. And they don't seem, you know, Odysseus doesn't seem to have the command to instruct them to leave, which strikes me as very, very odd. If he is in charge, yes, it reminds me that the whole mechanism of the Iliad is Achilles revolting against Agamemnon, who's in charge of all of the whole 1,000 ships going to Troy, and he's still sulking in his tent with his arms folded, going, "No, I'm not going to fight anymore. I don't care. I'm not going to." That these kings, these commanders, could be challenged. So there was no sense that if you challenge one of your commander, that it would be instant death. You know, you think of the British Navy in the 18th century or something, or the British Army or any.
They all got drunk. They all got drunk when they killed all the sheep and stayed and drank all the wine.
Yeah.
I think that would. They didn't take orders because they were all drunk.
Yeah, which suggests pretty poor discipline, because I don't think in any body of men. So they lose about 72 there. They lose 25 during the course of the Lotus Eaters adventure. 4 men killed in the Cyclops, and is it 6?
6, I think.
6, I think it's 6. I'm not sure why I said 4. Aeolus, nobody dies during that adventure, but they get blown back to where they came from, and there's only 1 man who dies to the Laestrygonians directly, but then 11 ships get destroyed. So that's at a single stroke.
So the other men all crowded onto the remaining ship.
No, I couldn't have.
No, they went down with the ship.
Oh, yeah,
11
yeah,
men.
yeah.
at the stroke.
And what struck me about that was that Odysseus had the foresight to park his boat in a hidden place.
Yes.
And he didn't tell his men to do that, that he left them to their own devices, and they were right there where they could receive all these rocks from the.
Well, maybe each captain of the ship was in charge of the ship itself. And their allegiance to Odysseus was more, I will follow you, and not that Odysseus could say, I'm in charge of you. Maybe we're looking at it in a different way, that they choose to follow him, but they can also choose not to follow him.
I get
So
that.
we nominate you our boss,
Yeah,
but I'm in charge of my ship. And if I want to do something different, I will. I mean, I don't know. It just seems to me, I think that the structure, it would be it's like there were people who volunteered to go, but therefore they would be volunteering in their own, with their own sort of what do you call it, ideas of what they would or wouldn't do. It's not like an army like of the Romans or the British army.
or Alexander, you mentioned before.
Yeah.
And also when in that chapter 8 where Athena's going around persuading young men to go on the boat. Nobody says you know, get into line, get on the boat.
They haven't been brainwashed to.
No.
Follow
They
later.
had to be persuaded, and you know, it's an adventure, you'll love it, you know.
I wondered whether it also is bringing out the difficulties of leadership.
Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown and all that. Yeah, I mean, it for someone who is so extraordinarily capable and is famous for being so capable as Odysseus, he doesn't seem very capable of actually leading successfully.
Yeah.
You know, okay, so maybe the discipline wasn't such that he could simply instruct them, but nor does he seem to be able to persuade them, you know, with kind of rhetoric. I mean, going back to the Aeolus story, which you'll see in book 10, they frankly just don't believe him or trust him at all. And they're actually complaining, well, it's okay for him, because he's the one who ends up getting all the goodies. We don't get anything, it's poor bloody infantry.
But they don't revolt.
They don't. Well, they commit a revolting act in terms of opening up the bag of winds.
Sort of passive aggression.
So it is interesting. I mentioned before that the new translation of the Odyssey by Daniel Mendelssohn, who's who is a classical scholar but also writes really well for the New Yorker and so on. He wrote a book a few years ago about his father saying, I'm going to come and sit in on your undergraduate course on the Odyssey. And all his dad does is complain about what a terrible leader the Odyssey is. And it occurred to me that actually it's kind of a narrative device to be able to explore that side of Odysseus, his dad is right. He can't persuade people by instructing them. He doesn't rule with an iron fist, but nor does he rule by persuasion either. He seems to lack that sort of ability as well.
It must have been incredible. Well, looking at it from now, You would think it would have been incredibly embarrassing to be the only one that survived and roughing that. It's nobody.
Well, and that's the odd thing about this, because this is a first person narrative by Odysseus telling us about all the things that have gone on. And it doesn't seem to occur to him that he comes out of this very badly.
Yeah.
He couldn't, he blames his men. And in fact, if you remember right at the very beginning of the whole, the Odyssey, it refers to the folly of the men, and he lost everybody, it wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
It's like sort of special pleading, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So he gets by because he's protected by Athena, really.
Yeah.
Like, in himself, he's really actually not up to much as a leader, but because he's got Athena on his side, he gets through, he wins.
Yeah.
Do you think that in those days, they just took it for granted that there'd be so many deaths and he'd lose men on ships, that they were just taken as, that's what happened?
Well, certainly the men are of no account at all. If you have to lose all 700 of them, it's kind of, oh, well,
I mean,
easy come, easy go.
yeah.
But the
Like
thing
the
is,
First World War.
Yeah, yes.
but if they all come from the island, Ithaca, which is a tiny island without much wealth, it's not like a prosperous island. If you take 700 men, you've left a lot of women behind.
Yeah, and sons.
And
as
so,
well.
yes, I mean, it's almost like taking half of the island's men, I imagine.
And all the best men, the
Yeah.
rotten suitors are left
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah.
Well, it's clear that not all of the suitors come from Ithaca, so it seems as if
Oh, yes.
Odysseus' influence is
For
broader
building
than just,
before that.
it does extend to the mainland. We know that he's got some land where he pastures cattle on the mainland, so he's kind of got a broader influence. But it certainly helps to explain the kind of the breakdown of civic society at Ithaca, because you've lost all of the men
Yeah.
in whom all of the power and the authority rested. The women didn't have any power, so when the men went, it wasn't as if the women could step up and take over. They were still just as helpless. So as in many societies where there's been civil war or whatever, and an entire generation is lost, the young men are lawless and wild, and they're on the brink of overtaking Ithaca, which is why the urgency for the whole story that drives it forward. So then we have we are told explicitly there are 46 men left, including Odysseus, and then we have the kind of the rather pathetic and comical story of Elpenor, who is the young chap who goes up to sleep off the wine by sleeping on the roof, and wakes up in the morning when Odysseus is saying, "Right, everyone, we're off." And Elpenor forgets that he's on the roof and walks off into Hades. But it reminds me too, going back to that thing about his authority, that Eurylochus, who is the character who comes to disobey Odysseus and saying, I'm not going back, I'm not doing this anymore, that he's kind of openly revolting. And as I say, in kind of standard military discipline, that would be instant death. You'd be
a traitor.
You'd be having taken out and executed, because otherwise, if you let one get away with it. In the Iliad, there is this character called Thersites, who is described as being incredibly ugly and unattractive, and he does something similar. He complains about all of this stuff, and Odysseus beats him in front of everybody, and they'll sort of laugh and mock him. But again, there's no sense that to openly speak against the leadership would be instant death. That doesn't happen. He just gets.
You think that's why the Romans had decimation?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They had what?
Well, they used to kill one person out of every 10 to make the
Where the
church
term
pay.
to decimate comes from. They would go down the line and pick out every tenth man of an underperforming unit. You didn't even have to be rebellious if you just didn't perform as expected.
You wouldn't want to join the army, really, would you? Gosh. Is that what the Romans did?
Yeah,
That was the Romans did.
Yes.
yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
And then Odysseus goes down by himself to the underworld. It's really spooky, weird story, where he meets Elpenor and realizes they've got to go back and bury him. But he also meets his own mother. He doesn't know that his mother is dead, and meets her down there and meets Achilles. And Achilles is, well, we'll get to see all of that in book 11. And then he comes back for Cersei. Sorry, I've left the lines in there. That's not nothing to do with the number of people anymore.
I'm wondering about that.
I was gonna say-
Whether they resurrected
And they've had a few
So he
birds
loses
as well.
half dozen men to the beast, the silver and gorgeous beast. And then the remaining 38 men, apart from Odysseus, are all killed as a result of the capital of the sun god episode. So then but the source for this, as I say, is Odysseus, a notorious liar and bullshit artist. This is his first person account of all of this stuff. And this is what he tells us happens, and we seem to be embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
So it does strike me as odd. Anyway, so that takes us on to books 9 and 10, and we have Odysseus sit down and say, well, I am in fact Odysseus. Presumably there's a big intake of breath all around as they realise they are in the presence of greatness.
Yeah.
If there's anything at all you want to pick up that you've noticed.
I think the king was very suspicious. Yeah, because the king was the only person I heard him crying.
Yes, yeah, and knows that this is not a usual reaction to a bard. You can be moved by a bard, but not heaving great sobs of tears.
So the going for this had something to do with that war. We didn't know exactly who he was, but yeah.
There's a very famous crux in book 9, round about line 22 or so onwards. Sunny Ithaca is my home, because if Ithaca is supposed to be where Odysseus is written, the modern Ithaca is supposed to be the same as ancient Ithaca. There's a real puzzle about because his description here doesn't fit where Ithaca is. He says, atop her stands our sea mark, Mount Neriton's leafy ridges shimmering in the wind. Around her a ring of islands circle side by side. Dulichion, Sami, which is which time, I can't remember, wooded Zakynthos too. But mine lies low and away, the furthest out to sea, rearing into the western dusk while the others face the eastern breaking day. Mine is a rugged land, but good for raising sons. And I myself, I know no sweeter sight on earth than a man's own native country. That doesn't fit the actual physical description of Ithaca, and people have thought about that ever since as to whether Ithaca really is Ithaca and so on.
Or is it just poetic license?
Is it just?
Poetic license.
Well, yeah, it's hard to see what he's achieving by changing it.
Trying to make it sound more interesting or more desirable.
Yeah,
Where are we at the moment? Chapter.
we're in book 9,
Yeah,
and it's sort of lines 20 to 30.
I was right before. Yeah. Okay.
Into some of it.
Yeah. Yes.
What's sea map? Does that mean
Simon,
we can see it?
sorry, what?
Sea map in that line, atop it stands our sea map.
Oh,
We can see it anywhere.
yeah, that
And
would
so-
be the identifying,
Yeah.
that's how you know it's Ithaca, because you can see that,
That,
yeah,
no,
only Ithaca that looks like that. Which does fit, because the northern part of Ithaca, well, they're both very hilly, there's kind of an isthmus in the middle, sort of like a figure of 8, and they're both very mountainous, and Odysseus's palace is in the north on what might be Mount Neriton. Anyway, moving on, going back to what we were talking before about the strange nature of his command. In line 50 he says, then I urged them to cut and run, set sail, but would they listen? It's a very strange thing for someone who's supposed to be in charge.
Okay, listen here.
Yeah.
You imagine a commander of an army these days saying, well, I gave the order, they would listen to
Not
me.
imagine Montgomery or, you know, somebody saying that to his
No,
troops.
so not these mutinous fools.
Yeah,
Mm.
and if they are mutinous, what are the implications? Where's the accountability?
Yeah.
Round back down middle of sort of 75 or so. Now Zeus, who masses the storm clouds, hit the fleet with the north wind. Homer has a difficulty. He's got to kind of steer between a couple of challenges, because the general story is that the Greeks, when they take Troy, behave so despicably that the gods are appalled, and that Zeus wants to strike them down and wants to make life difficult for them. But he has somehow to get Poseidon to be responsible for Odysseus's specific inability to get home, apart from, you know, just by the skin of his teeth and having lost all of his men. So if you look carefully, you can see there's a little bit of sort of a shuffle going on there, a little bit of a sleight of hand. That sometimes early on it seems to be Zeus, but later on it becomes obvious that it's Poseidon, and it's Poseidon because Poseidon is the father of the Cyclops. So what is done to the Cyclops is what causes Poseidon to be furious with Odysseus. And specifically, because Odysseus, again, this kind of hot-bloodedness, he wants to let the Cyclops know who he is. So it would have been, and his men are saying, why would you do that? Why are you telling them? You know, why are you letting everybody know that this cannot turn out well?
Yes, he won't give up, really. He escapes. And then he sort of goes back.
Yeah,
And you know,
quit when he's ahead.
yeah.
What you were saying, I can't remember what someone was saying before, something that prompted me to think maybe about the Lotus Eaters, is that each of these adventures seem somehow to be, you know, they're kind of temptations or dangers or challenges. It's not always quite obvious what exactly the nature of them. You know, they almost feel like a parable, like one of Jesus' parables or something. But it's not quite clear what the temptation is. You know, that with the Lotus Eaters, is it just this, that if you get into the good life, then you can just waste your life away and lose sight of your real purpose or meaning, or
Bit like LSD.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
I guess so. That if you become, that
You
if
go into your own world.
the opium eaters, you know, kind of thing. That if you get drawn into that too much, then you just lose your.
You don't want to get out of
It's
it.
basically his interest in real life. All you want is this
Yeah,
drug-induced fantasy.
yeah.
Mm.
It's a little bit more obvious that the Cyclops represents a kind of a lack of civilization. You know, it says round about line 28 or so, that the Cyclops live each of the Cyclops live each a law to himself, ruling his wives and children, not a care in the world for any neighbour. And that's, you know, that sort of lack of civilization is clearly a lower form of existence.
It goes with being one-eyed.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
But they,
Jack
Did
and
someone
the
say Pineapple
Beanstalk.
Supporter? Sorry?
Jack and the Beanstalk comes to mind when I
Yes,
say that. You know, he's a giant and he eats people.
Yeah.
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 So,
And this, you know, this is a very different world from the world that we've been in, even right up to the Phaeacians, you know, where you feel like there's a kind of real psychological truth to this. Now we are meeting giants and monsters and ogres and those kind of temptations.
but I think people love stories of giants and things. Well, seamen, all these sea monsters that used to come out of the sea and grab the ships. That was right up until recent times. Seamen believed all that sort of stuff. And there was something in the papers the other day about giant squids. That people really didn't believe, you know, modern people didn't believe. Now they And they have found that they live down deep and they can come up and they're pretty big. So, you know, that's where it all comes from. So they love to hear that sort of stuff.
Yes.
There's sort of a general feeling that if there's any kind of parable, is that don't think you can control anything, because you can't. You can get monsters, you can get gods, you can your men can run away, you know. You're basically at sea.
Yeah.
Just accept it.
It's like a chaos theory.
Yeah, that's right. And if and even the gods, you know, they'll give you one thing, take away another, you know. So just, you know, just take it and carry on.
As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods.
Yes, indeed.
They kill us.
But you're right about the monsters when you think about it. There's been big, you know, the Yetis, and I think there's
Yeah, that's right.
there's other ones through history. Even in Harry Potter, there's the big one. What's it called? It was I've forgotten, a troll. Yeah, trolls. The concept of trolls, which were, you know, we human beings produce these big uncontrollable giants.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So again, is it from here, or is it just something the way the human mind works? Is it all done separately, or is it?
Yeah, so that we don't have to be monsters. We can say those are the monsters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, it has been suggested that the idea of the Cyclops comes from elephants. The elephants still existed in the Mediterranean at this time, and if you see the skull of an elephant, there is a big hole in the middle where the
trunk,
the trunk goes. And if that's what you find, it looks like the skull of a one-eyed peacock, and you can follow up email.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea of, and this is changing subject a bit, but it does relate to levels of sophistication in the different places. Do we have any idea of what the ships were like?
Yeah, quite a bit. I'll find an illustration. You know, there are enough descriptions of them that there are.
the Greek
We know
triangle.
what the parts and we know what they look like. I'll find one of the illustrations.
They were beautiful looking.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have been 5-star though.
No.
Sally Cruise.
I think I'm pretty sure I told you that the when I was at Ithaca. At the museum, there was a big stone, like a kind of triangular stone that had 3 holes in it, and I was asking the guide, "What is this?" And the guy who brought us there, who's a diver, said that is an anchor from this period, and it had 3 holes in it because it would have big pieces of wood through it because the wood could break. That's what would drag on the floor of the ocean. You know, these big heavy stones, and he said, "I see those out in the water now. There's still plenty of things around there from around this period." But we know there was that there was a lot of trading going on
That's what I was
of
wondering.
copper and of tin and of gold and of foodstuffs going on around the Mediterranean. So that they really were very adept mariners at the time.
The ships they couldn't stay at sea for too long. They couldn't take too much food. The decks were open, and if you had 50 odd sailors, you couldn't. When Alexander the Great, when he had ships, they had to go in each night or two to the land when they were coming back from India, because they weren't like modern ships. They couldn't stay at sea, and if they did, well, they'd run out of food or water or whatever,
And they're small enough to be. It says that it takes them up onto the beach. Well, a ship can't be too big if you're bringing it up onto the beach.
Beach, yeah.
Yeah, beach it, and they have they row them, but they've also got sails, because it says here something about after 3 days of rowing, we were able to put up our sail,
Oh, yeah.
because the wind was blowing in the right direction.
Yeah, they could, I think they couldn't tack, could they, those triremes, that, they could only have the wind behind them, so they needed the oars to.
Yeah, that's what it sort of sounds like,
Mm.
because after on the third day they could put it up, which
Yeah.
meant that the wind was in the right direction.
Yeah.
It'd be, yeah, but you still, when you think about it, the Mediterranean's big, to go out with one of those relatively small compared to what we have today,
Mm.
you have to be
Man.
stupid or
brave.
brave.
Brave, yeah.
No choice.
Yeah, they would be, yeah, pretty big holes in the, in the thing, because they obviously got loads of gold, and gold's quite heavy, and the stuff when they sort of sack the place and get all the good stuff out.
It's a good thing they only had boats, because they might have taken more than.
So then we get into the whole story of the Cyclops, which is one of those really, really famous stories, and Odysseus very smartly tells the Cyclops that his name is no one, which leads to about line 450 when he's been blinded, and the neighbours come out and say, what's going on? What in Polyphemus, what in the world's the trouble? Roaring out in the God-sent night, you robbers of our sleep. Surely no one's rustling your flocks against your will. Surely no one's trying to kill you now by fraud or force. Nobody, friends, Polyphemus bellowed back from his cave. Nobody's killing you now by fraud and not by force. So they go, all right, there's nobody doing it, then
It's funny,
nothing to see here.
it's funny, that's a word which you wouldn't think it would be translated to the English language, nobody.
Yeah.
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 So
Well,
this,
it has been.
it is one of the themes of the Odyssey, of kind of identity and Odysseus disguising who he is. But there's actually, and it's impossible to bring this out in an English translation, but there is a level to this pun which is even cleverer than it sounds. But in line 461, they lumbered off, but laughter filled my heart. So this is Odysseus telling the story. Laughter filled my heart to think how nobody's name, my great cunning stroke, had duped them one and all. So the word for no one in Greek is metis, which is kind of like the negative, no one, metis. So that's who no one is. But my great cunning stroke is actually a translation of the word metis, which is spelled the same. It's got a slightly different accent, but metis, which means kind of intelligence or cunning. So Odysseus is kind of weaving in this sort of triple pun, which is literally untranslatable. You can't get that, and you would easily overlook it if you're just reading it in the translation, because you wouldn't know that it's there. So my great cunning stroke sounds exactly the same as no one. Anyway,
Okay.
there you go.
Yeah.
So they get away, but his reason for needing the Cyclops to know his name, it's not quite as vainglorious as it sounds, because Odysseus, like anyone at this time, is very concerned about his kleos, his reputation, his glory, which is the only form of immortality that is available in the culture at the time. And your kleos is the stories that people tell about you after you have gone, your glory, your reputation. So it's like you live on after you have died in what people say about you. Well, if the Cyclops doesn't know who it was who did this, then there's no way for that reputation to be spread further.
Yeah.
Apparently, but it still does sound like a terrible blunder, and it's what costs the lives of 700 men. Odysseus' mistake, they pay for it, and he still gets home to Ithaca. So then we get on to book 10, which is when we get to meet Circe, who is the goddess who turns the men into pigs. And the subject of Bloomsday and Melbourne's play this year, using on James Joyce's Ulysses, is actually this this episode, which in Ulysses is set in the brothel district of Dublin, where the men's baser appetites are being entertained, and the men turning into our animal natures. So again, you know, the Odyssey is kind of always playing with this notion that humans are capable of so much, such great potential, but at the heart of it, we are still, you know, we are flesh and blood, which is why Odysseus cries and eats and drinks and has sex with Circe. But even here, having overcome her lures, he is still he's the one that is tempted now. They live there, they stay there for a year, and eventually it's the men who have to say to Odysseus, "Come on, we've got to get home. You can't stay here forever." I mean, assuming that sex with the goddess must be pretty fabulous, but you're still going to get home at the end of the day. So they do, and but before they do, she says, "I've got news for you, mate, which is you're going to have to go down to Hades to find out important information before you can get home." And he actually, that's such a terrible prospect that he actually contemplates suicide. I can't quite remember where this is, but he says it. I thought about just chucking myself over the side of the ship, because this is just so terrible a prospect to have to go down to the underworld, the kingdom of the dead, which is what lies ahead of us in book 11.
Yeah.
So for next time, we'll be talking about what we've read in books 9 and 10, and what you want to bring up out of that, and then we'll be previewing the voyage to the kingdom of the dead.
It's amazing how he took it that there's a goddess, but that she told me had to go down to the kingdom of the dead. He didn't say, "Oh, can I skip that step?"
Well, it's kind of part of Odysseus's sort of abasement. He has to go to the, you know, this is a sort of a world of magic and of sorcery, and you know, there is some connection here with Jesus Christ, because Christ of course does the same thing. He goes, you know, that in the Christian concept, we are saved because Christ conquers death, and in that sense,
And comes up from the
and comes up. Yeah, it's, you know, anyone can go for a kingdom of the dead. Getting back,
Getting
it's
back.
difficult. It's a one-way ticket.
There's also in the Christian tradition that descending into hell, Jesus descending into hell before the resurrection.
Sorry.
There's you know, as a parallel to
Yeah.
Hades. I think it's after Jesus died, he descended into hell.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's
for the resurrection.
that's Sunday.
Yeah.
It seems that all these early civilizations, people, you know, the Egyptians, all the work they put in with their pyramids, with their kings, and it goes right back, you know, as early as you think. I mean, in Turkey, you can see all these tombs, and they're the, you know, row of them, and they're from very early civilizations that did all this, you know, because they put the body in, and it was to preserve them to the afterlife and all this sort of stuff. So they had a real big feeling for this sort of stuff. And you sort of wonder how, when that came in, was it always in? You know?
Well, ceremonial burials. It used to be believed that Homo sapiens was the, you know, that we kind of invented that, but there now seems to be evidence that Neanderthals have ceremony. You know, they used to have grave goods buried with people. So there was clearly some sort of sense that maybe not that death is not the end, but something about, you know, that mortality, I suppose, is the great mystery of humanity, isn't it? And it's kind
It
of
seems to go back a long way. I mean, you go right back to the Aboriginal people in Australia, even. When they're always been 65,000 years ago. This is well before what we're talking about.
It's a sort of human need as well, isn't it? If someone dies, to feel that they're not quite gone. So you might have an elaborate funeral or bury their favorite things with them or whatever, because it's actually more about the mourners than the dead person, and it helps to believe that they're on a journey.
sorry,
Sorry, no, that was me using my Apple pen.
it's really striking that because this is a really good encapsulation of what the people of this time in this part of the world believe happened after death. And it's, there's no sense of paradise or heaven.
No, it's very
reward.
grim.
There's no heaven for the good and hell for the bad. You're just in this kind of almost like a half-life. You survive on
You have to drink sheep.
shade.
You have to drink sheep's blood to try to speak.
Yeah, to kind of animate you
Yeah,
briefly before you fall back into this kind of coma.
The whole geography of Hades is interesting, isn't it? Because I think there are 4 rivers, and there's Lethe, which is forgetfulness, and there's another, I can't remember that, but I'm looking forward to reviewing that, because it's quite interesting, the routes to death in a way. Yeah, there's no relief from it from Hades. It's just they suffer. The dead people suffer, really.
Yeah, so sort of the flip side of this is why I guess if you've got so ill-formed a concept of what happens after death, that's why your immortality, your kleos, your glory becomes so important, because that's the only form of real immortality that's available to you, your kind of reputation. And that seemed to have been much more important to the Greeks, because that was it. There wasn't anything else. Whereas in the Christian cosmology, or however you want to describe it, there is a reward or punishment waiting for us after life, which kind of is often used to sort of say that that life, in a sense, is less important. Your purpose is to achieve everlasting.
But the Greeks seem to have it pretty well organised. And then when he went down, they met all these people, to meet the great one. There was a story about, I'm in the presence of whoever it was, all this sort of stuff. So I thought, it's pretty well organised down there.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, or one of the really interesting encounters is Achilles. Odysseus meets Achilles, and if you remember, the whole of the Iliad was about Achilles insisting upon his own reputation. His honor is insulted by Agamemnon, and he's not going to put up with that. Because Achilles, as a demigod, he has goddessy ancestry, but he can die, and in fact does die. So he is faced with a terrible choice between dying young and achieving great glory as a fighter, or living a long and happy life, but not achieving glory. So he's kind of torn between these two choices, and in effect, he gets to give his verdict from the other side when Odysseus goes down and meets him. And I won't spoil what his answer is, but his response is really, is really interesting, because it raises then questions about meaning, about whether your immortal glory is worth all of that, and whether you would still be happy with your choice if afterwards, if you could reflect, would you have chosen differently?
Yes.
Was it Achilles who was killed at Troy? Was that Paris? Who was that? the son who was killed. at Troy.
No, yes, well, the 9 of them in the Iliad actually die, but we do know because Achilles gets shot in the heel, which is the only bit that his
Yes,
mother,
didn't dip
she
in.
dipped him in the river of immortality, but she forgot that she was holding him by the ankle and didn't do that bit.
And that's
But it's
your.
Hector is the prince who dies most famously in the Iliad and gets dragged around the city walls by Achilles. All right, well, we're ever so fractionally early, but thank you for your
Very good.
contributions.
Great, thank you.
And we look forward to fortnight.
Fortnight now.
Fortnight, chapters 9 and 10, and then previewing in the world. Excellent.